In the early 1990s,
Greece, a country of sunshine, myths, and ancient gods, was shaken by something it had never seen before. In a quiet suburb near Athens, a group of young people began gathering at night. To neighbors, they looked like ordinary students. One was handsome and charismatic, another shy and withdrawn, the third a girl from a good family. But when the doors closed and the candles were lit, their meetings turned into rituals that spoke not of God, but of something far darker. It all began with whispers, rumors of teenagers playing with the occult, speaking of demons and secret powers. Yet soon, whispers turned into headlines. Two people vanished, both under strange circumstances. And when the truth came out, the Greek public learned that these disappearances were not random, but sacrifices. How did ordinary young men and women, barely out of their teens, turn into self-proclaimed devil worshippers? What power did one charismatic boy hold over his friends, convincing them to follow him into murder? And how did an entire country react when it realized that satanic killings were happening not in a horror film, but in real life, just a few kilometers from its capital city? Tonight, we will explore one of the darkest true stories of modern Greece, the story of Asimakis Katsoulas, the so-called leader of the Satanists of Pallini. So close your eyes, let your thoughts drift, and prepare to follow me into a tale of mystery, manipulation, and murder. This is Sleeping Radio. The Greece of the early 1990s was a country caught between tradition and modernity. On one side, the Orthodox Church still played a dominant role in people's lives, guiding morality and shaping culture. On the other, new influences were creeping in: foreign music, films, and ideas, often glamorizing rebellion and darkness. For teenagers, especially in the suburbs of Athens, this was a time of searching for identity, belonging, and meaning. In the quiet suburb of Pallini, families lived in modest houses, children played in the streets, and parents believed they knew everything about their sons and daughters. But beneath the calm surface, there were cracks, moments of alienation, pressure, and unspoken desires. And in those cracks, shadows began to grow. At the center of this story was a young man named Asimakis Katsoulas. Born in 1974, he was tall, attractive, and intelligent. To his peers, he carried an unusual magnetism, something between confidence and mystery. But beneath that charm lay a fascination with the forbidden. Even as a teenager, he was drawn to the occult, reading books about magic, summoning rituals, and powers beyond the visible world. To many, these were harmless curiosities. To Katsoulas, they became an obsession. Around him gathered others who were searching for something larger than themselves. One of them was Manos Dimitra, 2 years younger. While Katsoulas was the leader, Dimitra was the devoted follower, eager to belong, desperate for guidance, and willing to be shaped. He found in Katsoulas a figure who seemed to know secrets hidden from the rest of the world. And then there was Dimitra Margariti, a girl of 18, shy but impressionable. She longed for escape from the ordinary life mapped out before her. When she met Katsoulas, she felt she had entered a world of mystery and meaning, a place where she was no longer invisible. The three of them formed a small circle. To outsiders, they were just friends. But in the secrecy of night, their meetings were different. They lit candles, chanted words they barely understood, and created an atmosphere where reality blurred with fantasy. For Katsoulas, these sessions were not games. They were rehearsals for something greater, a declaration of loyalty not to God or family, but to the dark forces he believed in. Soon their conversations went beyond curiosity. Katsoulas began to speak of sacrifice, of the need to prove devotion to the powers they called upon. He claimed that through offerings, through blood, they could gain control, strength, and even immortality. His words carried weight, and the others, already under his spell, listened in awe. What started as youthful rebellion slowly hardened into ritual. The trio became convinced that they were no longer just teenagers, but chosen servants of something ancient and powerful. They believed they had stepped onto a path that separated them forever from ordinary life. And so, in the quiet streets of Pallini, a story was beginning, one that would soon turn from whispers of magic to screams of terror. At first, their gatherings had the harmless look of adolescent daring. Candles from a corner shop, a deck of worn cards, a book with a pentagram on the cover that had more theatrical drawings than real doctrine. But something changed when Asimakis stopped letting the night choose the plan and started choosing it himself. He arrived with a timetable. He brought language that sounded older than the city that contained them. Invocations stitched together from half-translated grimoires, whispers copied from magazines, fragments lifted from movies and made to feel like scripture. He spoke slowly, never rushing, as if each syllable were an oath. And as he spoke, Manos leaned forward, learning the words until they tasted natural in his mouth. Dimitra closed her eyes and breathed in the smoke, convincing herself the air itself had changed. They began to meet away from the soft lights of Pallini's living rooms, empty lots beyond half-built houses, a clearing along a service road where the city's hum fell to a hush, the edge of a quarry where the wind carried their voices back like an echoing chorus. Asimakis liked these places because they felt like thresholds. A step past the streetlight, and the world they knew fell away. He told them that spirits favored boundaries, doorways, crossroads, abandoned chapels with missing doors. He taught them to imagine that they were no longer standing on the margins of Athens, but at the border between the seen and the unseen. Rituals acquired structure. There were hours they preferred. A late-night window when the last bus had already passed and dogs barked at nothing. There were tokens to carry, a length of red cord, a small brass bell, a triangle drawn in chalk that had to be traced 3 times and never stepped across until he said so. There were rules for silence, rules for who spoke when, rules for the order in which the candles were lit and extinguished. The rules built a wall around them. Inside the wall they were chosen. Outside it, parents and teachers and the bright, rational world had no claim. With structure came secrets. The trio learned the relief that secrecy can bring, the warm, illicit loyalty of being the only ones who know. They stopped telling true stories to friends at school. They invented alibis. Dimitra said she was revising for exams. Manos said he had taken an evening job. Asimakis said nothing at all. He had perfected the mask of the boy who is just passing through, so polite that no one thinks to linger with a question. And because nobody pressed them, the boundary thickened. The wall grew taller. Secrecy became a ritual all its own. The hunger for meaning swelled. It wasn't enough to light the candles. There had to be a sign. Asimakis promised there would be. Signs never come to the impatient, he said. The universe moves slowly for those who have not paid for its attention. And what is payment? Not money, not flowers to a shrine. Devotion. He started to measure their loyalty with tasks that felt small. Keep the fast. Memorize the chant. Face the dark without flinching. But each task carried a question inside it. How far will you go? When they went far, he praised them. When they hesitated, he smiled in a way that looked gentle and felt like a silent warning. From time to time, he widened the circle. Curious classmates were invited to a game. They came for novelty. They left unsettled, not sure why the laughter had died so early. A few never returned. A few returned once, only to be filtered out by a test that seemed accidental. A sudden chill on a warm night, a candle that refused to catch, a suggestion, light as dust. That belief required more than watching. By the end of that season, the circle had stopped growing. It did not need to. What mattered wasn't numbers. It was density. How tightly, how completely, 3 young lives could be woven into one will. And still the question of a sign pressed on them. They watched for shapes in smoke, for patterns in the rise and fall of a stray cat's cry, for coincidences that could be read as omens. Once, during a vigil, a streetlight buzzed, flickered, then died. They stood in the sudden darkness and felt power rush in. Not because anything supernatural had happened, but because meaning had been assigned to it. Asimakis let the silence deepen before he spoke. You asked, he said at last, and you were answered. That was enough to lift their fear and replace it with the trembling pride of initiates. But pride is restless. Once you believe the hidden world has leaned in to listen, you want it to speak. And speaking, in their minds, required proof. Proof, in the stories they devoured, had weight and scent. It left a mark. So the rituals grew bolder. They stayed out later. They drove further, testing the outskirts of Karopi and the scrublands beyond. seeking places where the night felt heavy. They brought offerings now, wine poured onto dry earth, photographs burned until faces dissolved, small animals that made Dimitra look away, and Manos watch with a fascination he tried to call holy. Doubts came like mist and passed the same way. Dimitra's hands shook sometimes when the chant reached its climax. Manos woke from dreams he did not describe. For both of them, doubts softened whenever Asimakis looked at them and named them chosen, a word that can be intoxicating in a world where most people feel invisible. He said they were no longer playing at darkness. They were students. He said students become adepts by deeds as much as by words. And then came the threshold night. Even years later, none of them would agree on whether it had been planned or if it had simply arrived the way storms do. Inevitable once all the pressure is in place. They drove until the city fell behind and the asphalt narrowed to a strip of road that coiled between fields. They parked by a stand of pines. The wind lifted and laid down the branches like a slow tide. Tonight, Asimakis said, we stop asking to be noticed. Tonight, we announce ourselves. He drew the triangle with deliberate strokes, the chalk crumbling, his breath steady. He placed the bell beside the red cord and set the candles at the triangle's corners. He told them to remember this exact arrangement because from now on they would be building on it. Layer upon layer, oath upon oath. He spoke a vow, a long, unbroken thread of words about power and protection, about crossing the veil and not being cast back. He ended with a line that neither of them had heard from him before, a line that felt like a door unlocking. Dedication requires an offering. The wind fell still. The road behind them felt 1,000 miles away. Dimitra's mouth went dry. Manos thought of every other night, and how this one felt different, as if the ground under their feet had shifted a centimeter and would never slide back. "Oh, what kind?" he asked. But he asked softly, as though speaking too loudly might call whatever answer waited in the trees. Asimakis did not reply. He only raised his eyes and held theirs, letting the weight of the unspoken settle. In the silence, the meaning became a shape they could both recognize, awful and irresistible, like a shadow cast by something just out of sight. They had asked for a sign. The sign, it seemed, was what they would choose next. The months passed, and what had once been strange experiments soon became the rhythm of their lives. For Asimakis, it was no longer about curiosity. It was about control. He spoke as though he were the vessel of something higher, a messenger who carried knowledge others couldn't dare to touch. He fed Manos and Dimitra on a steady diet of half-truths and invented lore, weaving stories of ancient rites and promises of immense power. The city around them was ordinary, bustling cafes, the chatter of schoolyards, the clatter of buses. But the trio lived in a parallel world. Their notebooks contained not algebra problems, but invocations. Their thoughts circled not exams or careers, but signs and sacrifices. each night of secrecy separated them further from their families. Home was no longer home. It was a disguise they wore until the next gathering. Still, a hunger remained unsatisfied. The rituals were intense, the chants intoxicating, but the darkness they invoked demanded proof. To feel chosen was not enough. They had to show it. And slowly, Asimakis began planting seeds that could grow only one way. He reminded them of the word offering. He spoke of how small gestures, wine, blood from a finger, the sacrifice of an animal, were stepping stones. But to move from apprentice to true adept, there had to be something greater. Dimitra grew pale when these words appeared. Her nights were restless, haunted by whispers that weren't quite dreams. Yet, when she thought of backing away, the fear of losing her place beside him chained her tighter. Manos, meanwhile, leaned in closer. To him, hesitation was weakness. He wanted proof of power, something undeniable that would silence every doubt. And Asimakis, sensing this hunger, nurtured it carefully. They began watching others, not just shadows anymore, but people. A girl walking home from school. A woman standing alone at a bus stop. Faces blurred into the night. But to the trio they were possibilities. They told themselves these were not plans, only imaginings, stories shared under moonlight like a test of courage. Yet the more they imagined, the easier it became to cross the line from what if to why not. The first attempt was clumsy, almost hesitant. They followed a stranger one night, their footsteps quick, their breaths shallow. But nerves cracked the spell. They retreated before anything happened, hearts racing, ears ringing with shame and relief. That near failure only deepened Asimakis's resolve. He told them that fear was natural, that even initiates of ancient cults trembled before their first act. But once committed, the trembling would end, replaced by certainty. And so he prepared them for another night. This time there would be no retreat. The instructions were simple. Trust me. Follow me. Do not question me. He repeated them until they became a litany. To disobey was to break the circle, to betray the darkness that had accepted them. Dimitra carried unease like a stone in her chest. She wanted to ask, why us? Why must this be the way? But the answer was already written in Asimakis's eyes. To question him was to be cast out, and to be cast out was to become ordinary again. Condemned to the dull world of parents and teachers and fluorescent lights. She chose silence, and silence became complicity. The night came cold and moonless. They drove beyond the suburbs toward Karopi, where the land opened into scrub and empty fields. The candles were not lit this time. There would be no need. The ritual was not symbolic anymore. It was action. The trio carried themselves with the gravity of soldiers marching into battle, though none dared say the word aloud. Their victim was chosen with chilling simplicity. A girl, barely in her teens, lured by the promise of adventure, by the magnetism of people who seemed older, freer, touched by something exotic. She trusted them. She walked with them. She laughed nervously, thinking it a game. But as the car slowed in the darkness, the laughter died. The trees loomed. The ground felt heavier beneath their steps. And somewhere, in the silence between heartbeats, she must have realized that this was not a game at all. The rest unfolded quickly, almost mechanically, as though the script had already been written and the actors had only to play their parts. Fear mixed with thrill. Devotion clashed with doubt. But the line was crossed. Once crossed, there was no turning back. By dawn, the trio had stepped into a world from which they could never retreat. The secrecy that had once bound them now shackled them. They had made an offering, not to demons, not to shadows, but to the hunger for power and belonging that had consumed them all. And in the days that followed, the city remained unaware. Life continued with its normal rhythm, even as a family somewhere grieved the disappearance of a daughter. No one knew yet that Athens had birthed its own tale of horror, one that would only deepen with time. Morning light has a way of softening nightmares. For Asimakis, Manos, and Dimitra, the first day after the crime passed like a dream half remembered. The sun rose over Athens. Children laughed on their way to school. The smell of bread drifted from bakeries. Yet, in the quiet places of their minds, a new reality had settled. They had crossed the threshold. They were no longer just teenagers dabbling with the occult. They had acted. At first, there was a sense of power. Asimakis carried himself with an even greater air of command, as though the universe had confirmed his authority. He told Manos and Dimitra that they had proven their devotion, that the forces they had invoked would now look upon them with favor. The ritual circle, he said, had been sealed in blood. And to his followers, exhausted, terrified, but strangely exhilarated, those words felt like truth. But power always asks for more. In the weeks that followed, restlessness replaced satisfaction. The act had not quieted their hunger, it had sharpened it. For Manos especially, the memory replayed in flashes. The fear, the struggle, the final silence. He told himself it was proof of strength, that he had touched something few ever dared. Dimitra, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn. Shadows followed her into her sleep. Whispers pulled her awake in the night. She clung to Asimakis all the more, desperate for reassurance that what they had done was not meaningless horror, but sacred duty. To the outside world, the trio seemed ordinary. They sat in classrooms, rode buses, greeted neighbors. But cracks began to show. Their eyes lingered too long on headlines about missing persons. Their laughter sounded forced, brittle, out of step with their peers. Rumors began to circulate in Pallini. Rumors of strange gatherings, of chants heard in abandoned lots, of young faces seen wandering the fields at midnight. Most dismissed them as childish pranks, but a few parents whispered warnings at the dinner table. "Stay away from those kids." Asimakis, emboldened, began speaking of destiny. He told them their first act was only the beginning, a signal flare announcing their presence to the unseen world. "Power must be fed," he whispered. "Once awakened, it demands more." He framed their crime not as murder, but as initiation. The girl, he said, had been a vessel, an offering that opened the gates wider. If they stopped now, the gates would close, and everything they had done would have been for nothing. Manos absorbed every word, his devotion unshaken. He was ready for more, eager even. But Dimitra hesitated. She began to avoid their meetings, making excuses about family obligations. The images in her head were too vivid, the terrified eyes, the final moments. She told herself she had been tricked, manipulated. But guilt has its own chains, and those chains pulled her back. Each time she thought of walking away, Asimakis reminded her that secrets were dangerous. "You cannot run from what you are," he said softly, almost kindly. But the kindness was a mask. Underneath it was a warning. The circle tightened once again. They drove further afield, beyond the suburbs into desolate stretches of countryside where no one could hear a scream. They rehearsed scenarios aloud, speaking in code like soldiers planning a mission. They carried ropes, candles, knives, objects that once belonged to games and rituals, now sharpened into tools. And soon their hunger found another victim. Not a child this time, but a grown woman, stronger, older, yet just as vulnerable in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was lured by charm, by the casual confidence of youth, never suspecting that behind the smiles waited a trap. Her disappearance would be reported in the papers, another headline that hinted at danger but never guessed the truth. For the trio, it was confirmation. They had acted again, and the world had not stopped them. The stars still shone, the city still hummed, and no divine hand had struck them down. In their eyes, that silence was approval. But approval is not the same as safety. Each act left a trail. Whispers, suspicions, fragments of evidence scattered like breadcrumbs. And in time, those crumbs would lead investigators straight to them. For now, though, they moved deeper into shadow, convinced they were untouchable. What had begun as whispers of occult games had grown into something darker. A secret war against the very fabric of ordinary life. And in the houses of Pallini, parents began locking their doors a little earlier, holding their children a little tighter, without knowing that the danger was not a faceless monster from abroad, but 3 young souls from their own neighborhood. For a time, the trio lived as if they were untouchable. The ordinary world continued its routines. Children filled the schools. Shopkeepers opened their shutters each morning. Church bells rang on Sundays. And beneath that surface, Asimakis, Manos and Dimitra moved like shadows. They believed they had crossed into a higher state, that they were no longer subject to the laws that governed everyone else. Each night of secrecy deepened the illusion. But reality has a way of seeping through even the strongest delusions. By late 1993, the disappearances had begun to trouble Athens. Families cried out for answers. Local newspapers ran headlines filled with unease, and whispers spread that something unnatural was at work in the suburbs. Parents warned their children not to walk alone after dark. Taxi drivers traded stories about strange figures seen near Koropi, standing too still at the roadside, as if waiting for something only they could hear. The police at first dismissed the rumors. Missing persons, they said, were often runaways or cases of domestic tragedy. Yet the patterns gnawed at them. Victims were vanishing in the same rough area, under eerily similar circumstances. And as detectives compared notes, a suspicion grew. These were not isolated incidents. Meanwhile, the trio's lives were fraying at the edges. Dimitra was the weakest link, her guilt etched across her face. Friends noticed she was pale, distracted, her laughter absent. She began to avoid gatherings, but Asimakis's grip on her was relentless. "You cannot leave what you've become," he told her. To defy him meant not just betrayal of the circle, but exposure. The weight of that threat pressed her back into silence. Manos, in contrast, grew bolder. He bragged in coded language, hinted at secrets he couldn't reveal. In the classroom, he seemed restless, his eyes carrying the fever of someone convinced he belonged to a hidden order. He followed Asimakis blindly, his loyalty deeper than fear. And Asimakis himself? He became even more commanding, wearing a mask of confidence. Yet beneath it, paranoia crept in. He began to speak of enemies, neighbors, priests, even classmates, who might have sensed their power and were conspiring against them. He spun tales of spies and informants, convincing his followers that they were under watch, that the very act of being chosen brought danger as well as glory. The rituals changed, too. No longer playful or symbolic, they carried a defensive edge. Candles were lit not just to summon, but to ward off. Chants were spoken not with curiosity, but with desperation. They saw shadows where none existed, and every sound in the night became a possible intruder. The same secrecy that had once thrilled them now turned into chains of constant anxiety. Meanwhile, investigators began to focus on the Pallini area. Teachers had whispered about unusual behavior among certain students. Neighbors reported seeing teenagers wandering at odd hours, carrying bags that clinked with unknown objects. The authorities began compiling lists, tracing connections, asking quiet questions. The trio sensed the net tightening. Manos noticed strangers watching him. Dimitra swore she heard footsteps behind her at night. Even Asimakis, who had always preached strength, began to show cracks. he started carrying small charms, bits of string knotted in peculiar ways, claiming they would shield him from betrayal. Their unity was splintering. Once bound by shared secrets, now they were bound by shared fear. Trust turned brittle. Dimitra wondered if Manos might reveal something under pressure. Manos feared Dimitra's trembling silence might one day break, and both watched Asimakis carefully, as if gauging whether his strength was still real or only a performance. Still, Asimakis pushed forward. He told them that the only way to survive was to act again, to strengthen the bond, to prove once more their devotion. He painted their crimes as protection. If they stopped, he said, the darkness would abandon them, and then the world's punishment would fall. And so, even as the police circled closer, the trio prepared themselves for yet another act. Not out of desire this time, but out of fear. Fear of each other, fear of exposure, fear of what might happen if they admitted the truth, that their circle was nothing more than three lost souls bound together by lies, guilt, and blood. The walls were beginning to close, and soon the silence of Pallini's nights would be shattered, not by their rituals, but by the heavy boots of the law. By late 1993, the web of secrecy began to tear. For more than a year, Asimakis Katsoulas, Manos Dimitrakalis, and Dimitra Margariti had hidden behind rituals, half-truths, and the illusion that they were invisible. For now, though, they moved deeper into shadow, convinced they were untouchable. What had begun as whispers of occult games had grown into something darker, a secret war against the very fabric of ordinary life. But every crime leaves echoes, footsteps in the dirt, names whispered at the wrong moment, silences too heavy to ignore. And those echoes finally reached the ears of the investigators who had been quietly watching. The case broke not through grand strategy, but through fragments. A classmate recalled strange conversations about offerings. A neighbor reported seeing a young girl enter a car that matched Manos's description and never return. A relative of Dimitra mentioned her nervous behavior, her long absences at night, the way she jumped when certain questions were asked. Piece by piece, detectives connected the dots. What had once sounded like parental gossip about satanic teenagers began to look like something far more chilling and real. Surveillance began. Unmarked cars followed them through Pallini's streets. Police noted their late-night drives to the outskirts of Koropi, their secretive meetings. By December 1993, the authorities were certain. These three were not playing games. They were linked to murder. The arrests came on a cold 23rd of December, 1993. Police stormed into the quiet suburb, knocking down the door of ordinary houses where families had believed their children safe. Asimakis was taken first. He did not resist, but he smiled. A thin, unreadable smile that unsettled even the officers. Manos, caught shortly after, was pale and silent, trembling not with fear of the law, but with the realization that the world he thought untouchable had cracked. Dimitra broke down in tears the moment the handcuffs closed, whispering apologies no one around her understood. At the police station, the facade shattered quickly. Hours of questioning pried open the circle. Manos, ever the follower, leaned heavily on Asimakis' supposed authority, claiming he had only done what he was told. Dimitra, broken by guilt and fear, confessed more than the investigators expected, detailing rituals, lures, and the chilling words Asimakis had used to bind them. She described nights of chanting, offerings, and how the leader had promised power if they followed him into darkness. Asimakis himself remained defiant. He spoke with calm arrogance, insisting that what they had done was not madness but devotion, not crime but sacrifice. He referred to his victims not as people, but as vessels, proof of his twisted worldview. His lack of remorse stunned the court of public opinion even before the trial began. News of the arrests hit Greece like a thunderclap. Headlines screamed about the Satanists of Pallini. Television panels debated how such horrors could bloom among suburban teenagers. Priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of the occult, while frightened parents clutched their children tighter. To a deeply religious country, the idea of ritual murders carried a weight beyond crime. It was sacrilege, an invasion of evil itself. When the trial opened in July 1995, the courtroom overflowed with journalists and citizens. The atmosphere was electric, half courtroom, half spectacle. Prosecutors laid out the crimes in painstaking detail. The teenage girl, lured with promises of friendship, strangled and burned in a remote field. The married woman, abducted and killed in a brutal act that revealed the depths of their obsession. Dimitra, portrayed as the weakest of the three, was sentenced to 17 years, a punishment severe but lighter than her companions. Manos received 2 life sentences, and Asimakis, the self-styled leader, was condemned to 2 life sentences plus more than a decade in prison. The judge's words echoed through the chamber. This was not rebellion, not a mistake of youth, but deliberate evil. For many Greeks, the verdict brought relief, but not peace. Parents looked at their children differently, wondering what shadows might lurk behind ordinary faces. Communities asked themselves how 3 young people could descend so far into darkness without anyone intervening. And the name Asimakis Katsoulas became etched into the nation's memory as a synonym for corruption of innocence, for the dangers of blind devotion. Behind bars, the trio's lives diverged. Dimitra kept silent, fading into obscurity. Manos adapted to prison life, a follower without a leader. But Asimakis remained infamous, his every move watched, his every rumor magnified. He would spend over 2 decades in confinement, his story resurfacing from time to time, stirring fear and fascination in equal measure. Yet, even with the circle broken, the scars of their crimes lingered, in grieving families, in anxious neighborhoods, and in the collective imagination of a nation that had looked into the eyes of its children and seen monsters staring back. The trial ended. The sentences were handed down, and the country exhaled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The Satanists of Pallini, as the press named them, were behind bars. But the story did not fade. It lingered like smoke after a fire, clinging to the memory of a nation that had never imagined such horrors could rise from the quiet suburbs of Athens. For the families of the victims, justice was only a word. No sentence could return a daughter stolen in her youth. No prison bars could silence the echo of a woman's final cries. The grief endured in silence, year after year, as the names of the lost became symbols of innocence betrayed. Inside prison walls, the trio lived different fates. Dimitra Margariti, still young, slipped into anonymity. Her name rarely appeared again, her life swallowed by the consequences of a single, terrible allegiance. Manos Dimitra remained a follower even in confinement, his identity forever tied to the one he had chosen to obey. And Asimakis Katsoulas, the self-styled leader, remained a figure of fascination and fear. He was rumored to hold strange rituals even behind bars, his charisma undimmed, his mind still turning shadows into power. Whether truth or myth, such tales kept his legend alive. Years passed, decades even. And then, in 2016, news broke that Katsoulas had been released after serving more than 23 years. The announcement reopened wounds. Could someone who had once led others into ritual killings walk again among ordinary people? Should forgiveness, or even freedom, be allowed to such a man? For many, the answer was no. For others, the reality was unavoidable. Time had passed, sentences had been served, and the law had spoken. Since his release, Katsoulas has been seen occasionally in public, his once youthful face now marked by age, his presence still unsettling. By legal requirement, he reports regularly to the authorities, yet the unease remains. In Greece, his name is not forgotten. It is spoken in whispers, in late-night conversations, in cautionary tales told by parents who remind their children of the dangers of false leaders and blind devotion. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Satanists of Pallini. Not just the crimes they committed, but the questions they left behind. How could ordinary young people become so consumed by illusion that they embraced darkness over light? What hidden desires made them follow a leader into horror instead of walking away? And what does it say about us? That evil can grow not only in far-off nightmares, but in the house next door, in the faces we believe we know. For those who listen closely, the story is less about satanic symbols and more about human weakness. The longing to belong, the seduction of power, the terrible cost of surrendering judgment to another's will. These are not monsters born in shadows. They are people and that truth is the most haunting of all. And so, as the years turn and life moves forward, the tale of Asimakis Katsoulas and the Satanists of Pallini endures, part true crime, part warning, part ghost story whispered across a nation's memory. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into one of Greece's darkest chapters. As you drift now into rest, remember that the stories we tell are not just about horror, but about the fragile line between ordinary life and unimaginable choices. This was Sleeping Radio. Good night, and may your dreams be lighter than the shadows we've walked through.